Greetings, this is Lansing Online News Radio with Bonnie and Bill. You're listening to LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing. And my co-host Bill Castanier will be dashing in from the other room any moment. This is WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan, LCC Radio. Greetings, Bill. We have a new technical setup as we do periodically,
Yes,
so that gets exciting.
It acts differently over there.
It does. It plays. Well, we may be having problems because we're stopped now. So if you please go check.
Sure. Karen was supposed to stop for us or check.
Okay. All right. That'll be good. This is going to be an interesting session this evening for those of you who have been going to Lansing Online News. We are seeing that for those of you who are going to Lansing Online News, you're seeing that we've been covering the Stephen Maria Green case since last summer. What happened is that it began really for them about last January, but I didn't get to meet them until the picnic that I went to for the Human Solution, which is trying to keep court watchers active in watching medical marijuana cases in various places around the country, including Michigan. In Michigan, since the passage of the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act, I think for the first couple years there was a sense that the law was being implemented fairly well and people were trying new things, and we saw dispensaries downtown and lots of innovation. And then it seemed as though there was a sort of backlash that took place. The dispensaries disappeared. We saw more and more local jurisdictions deciding that they might or might not prosecute and ignore state law, and in essence announced they were going to go with federal law. So it's a concern. They got kind of caught in that net down in Oakland County, which has been the source. Stephen Maria lived down there at the time, and they were arrested on felony charges, though Maria is a caregiver and both of them are patients. They ran into some difficulty down there and ended up with felony charges, and it's now truly escalated into a major pitched battle because as of 2 weeks ago, they had their daughter Bree taken away from them by the Ingham County Family Court. And so now they're spending most of their lives involved in court cases. They've become sort of the poster children, unfortunately, for the sort of backlash that's taking place. So we'll be joined tonight by Stephen Maria and their attorney, Joshua Covert, who's been handling this. Bill has one announcement he'd like to make in advance.
Really quick. Tomorrow night, the Michigan Humanities Council is going to kick off the Great Michigan Read at 7 p.m. at the State Library. And it involves a conversation with Steve Luxembourg, who is the author of Annie's Ghost, and Marty Link, who's the author of Bootstrappers. And really the theme of the Great Michigan Read, which derives from Annie's Ghost, is about family secrets that are kept over generations that cause great damage to a person. So I think people will find it very interesting tomorrow night. Bootstrapper is about Marty Link's divorce and taking up a new life in Michigan, and in her book, she tells a lot of family secrets. And Annie's Ghost is about a gentleman who finds out that he had an aunt he never knew about that had been put in a mental institution when she was a child.
So what time does the program start?
7 p.m.
7 p.m.
And it's conversational.
That's at the auditorium?
The auditorium, right, in the State Library.
That's a beautiful
ground
facility.
Floor, beautiful facility, easy to get to, free parking.
Actually, that's one of the first places I actually saw Steve. He was testifying at a medical marijuana hearing when they were looking at adding new conditions to the medical marijuana law, and that's been up in the air as well. I would like to get started this evening with a bit of a wrap-up. Stephen Maria, what's happening in the situation with your daughter?
Right now, she's in foster care in the custody of my mom, her grandmother, and she was removed based on allegations from my ex-husband that there was drug use in the home, and they kind of went with the allegations and stopped there, and I think jumped the gun by removing her. And now we've been 10 days without her in our custody. Last Friday we had a review in front of the judge, and he did not order that my daughter come home to us, but he did order that restrictions be removed from our visiting times. So the amount of time that we get to see her is kind of unlimited right now, as long as my mom is there to supervise.
Now, your mom is 2.5 hours away,
Yes,
so that isn't easy. I mean, while it sounds, and I'm glad that they have done that and they have made the access easier, this really is still a very burdensome situation where you live here, your mom lives elsewhere. It's interrupted your breastfeeding. There's been all sorts of complications from this.
Right, yeah, there has been. We were able to spend 4.5 hours with Bree the other day, and we are going to spend tomorrow evening and then most of Wednesday with her. But you see, there's kind of, yesterday and today we haven't seen her at all. So there's still some lapses in the amount of time that we actually do get to see her between the drive and my mom's work schedule and things like that. But at least it's a quite a bit more flexible now.
As someone who saw both hearings,
Hmm.
and I saw the referee make the initial decision, and then I saw a week later, almost to the hour and the day of the time, I saw the judge himself, Judge Garcia, make his ruling, and it seemed as though I was very concerned that the Michigan medical marijuana law seems very clear on these issues. There's Section 4C that says that medical marijuana cannot be used in any way in terms of custody battles. And they wanted to preclude the idea that an unhappy parent could go to court and have used this medical marijuana as a reason to take children away. And it said there had to be special conditions that proved a certain level of dangerousness, that there were behaviors different than just the use of medical marijuana that would result in a justification for removing the child from the home. And even in both cases, though the guardian ad litem, who is supposed to be there representing the interests of the child, said that he felt there were ways that the child could stay in the home. In both cases, the referee and the judge went with removing the child, and that surprised me. Were you surprised by both rulings?
I was absolutely surprised. Like you said, I thought that I had these protections. It says in the law that I have these protections, and I've read the law hundreds of times, especially since going through our other court battles with the felony charges. And so I was quite surprised. I hear people often ask me, why did I make the choice? When they gave you the choice between your kid and cannabis, why did you choose the cannabis?
Oh, is that how it's being framed? Okay.
It is. I'm getting that a lot
Ah,
actually. And the law specifically says that I don't have that choice. Like it's not a choice that I have to make. And so it's still very surprising to me.
and one of the things in both cases, they seem to praise you a lot for being quote unquote clean. It still
Hmm.
seemed to be that sort of drug war rhetoric where taking medicine would somehow be a bad thing for you.
Right.
Now, you're an MS sufferer, and you've had some incidents since you've gone off cannabis as a
Hmm.
result of these court problems.
Hmm.
But it's not treated like any other medicine, is it?
It's not at all. I even said, like earlier when somebody asked me that question, and I said, uh, why is it a choice between your health care and your kid? You wouldn't ask a diabetic to choose between their insulin and their kid.
Yeah.
And somebody scoffed and said, well, a diabetic would die without their medicine. And I thought, well, that's the same for a lot of cannabis patients too. My husband very well could die without cannabis too because of the seizures and the brain damage that could ensue. And so, it really is this double standard right now that cannabis is still being seen as just another party drug.
Right. The perception, I think, on the part of a lot of people is that that the medical marijuana law was a way to skirt the law and allow recreational use and treat it as if somehow it's medicinal. And it's kind of the idea was it's almost with a wink and a nod. Oh, yeah, that's right, it's medicine, but we want to decriminalize, and this is the foot in the door. Steve, you're somebody who suffers severe seizures. And I don't mean to upset you by this, but a friend of mine had been working with a young child who was disabled. She's 5 years old. She's had severe seizures. She was not treated with cannabis to the best of my knowledge. And she died last Saturday from her seizures. I mean, it's a very dangerous illness. This is not an easy to treat illness, and you've had severe seizures. And ironically for you, cannabis oil was the only thing that really controlled them. And now you've been told you can't take a life-saving drug. I mean, in addition to, it just seems as though the misery being piled onto one family is just enormous.
Absolutely. I mean, just the fact of taking away the cannabis. I'd been on, 8 to 12 different anticonvulsant, anti-epileptic drugs, and none of them controlled my seizures completely. and they all caused different ordeals with side effects and a different, varying amount of side effects and other problems. And the current medication I'm on now is Keppra, and that was one that gave me the greatest amount of therapeutic relief other than the cannabis, and I've still had 8 seizures. While on that particular medication, and my neurologist has increased the dose again, which now, I can pretty much assure there's going to be more side effects. As you go higher with the dosages is when the side effects start to appear at a higher rate. And so that's scary enough as it is. And then to have this happen and to just be robbed of our child, and she's the one suffering in this the most, because she needs to have a nurturing bond with both of her parents, and to have that removed is obscene. And it really bothers me that we tried everything to avert the situation. And as you mentioned, the guardian ad litem as well, tried to mention remedies or other ways to deal with the situation, and it just shined through that that wasn't what was thought of from the bench, or from some of the other people that had an interest in this. And it just boggles my mind that people are stuck in like a reefer madness. They can't believe, even after Sanjay Gupta comes out with his show, and there's more anecdotal evidence every day, especially about with seizures. And as you mentioned, your friend's little child passing away, and John Travolta's son passed away.
Yeah.
It happens all the time with people, and I've suffered some really serious injuries while having seizures. And I'm very grateful that I'm still here, fully functioning.
Yes.
And able to be here with you in the studio today, because at any moment it is an honest and truthful fear I have that the next seizure could be the end. And so it scares me to death to live the life that we're forced into right now.
I'd like to ask John a question. I went to last week's hearing, and with my limited knowledge about medical marijuana, I only know what I've read, and I've read the law, of course, but I was surprised how little knowledge the judge had. And maybe this is the wrong thing to say, but is that then typical of your court situations and your extraordinary hearings, that the people who are hearing these cases really know nothing about medical marijuana?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. That's a lot of what I do, actually, is educating prosecuting attorneys and judges about the Medical Marijuana Act and how to deal with that, and how to interpret it. And I think a lot of what I do is education. And I think that's where to start off with a lot of these judges and prosecuting attorneys, is just to tell them about it and what the law is, because they don't know.
This is what really bothered me. I mean, there were two different standards. There really was no consistency in the judgments between the judgment of the referee who took your child away and then the judgment of the judge. The first judgment was, well, it's inherently dangerous to have any marijuana in the home because robbers with guns will come and get you. By that same standard, of course, then anybody who sends their kid to Sexton should have their children taken away, because Sexton is clearly a dangerous place where the kids will come after you with guns. I mean, there's no real logic there.
Logic is
tenuous at best. And I think that was so patently absurd on the face of it that a lot of people thought, well, that ruling couldn't stand. Mm-hmm. So that's why there was a rehearing a week later, which I gather is not all that common, to have a review by the judge a week later. But then he sort of changed the standard, despite the fact that he said that he would, just basically either affirm it or not. He came up with this new standard, which is kind of that there's no protection, unless it says specifically that you should be encouraged to smoke marijuana in front of your children, and it has to say that somewhere in the law, that you'd have to therefore take children away. And that doesn't make any sense to me either, because people who are taking Vicodin for pain, I mean, when I had my arm smashed, I was on Vicodin for a couple months, and I was, it was extraordinary. I was taking fairly high doses of it because the pain level was so high. So would that mean that anybody who was injured and taking a drug like Vicodin would have their children removed? And I mean, it just seemed to me that the logic behind the decision seemed flawed. Am I wrong in that, Joshua?
No, I would agree that the logic has been flawed. It seems like they're trying to find any rationale, and I don't think they have any reason to do this, but they're looking for something and coming up with, kind of like grasping at straws, to just come up with some reason to do this.
And it's that bias against marijuana, isn't it? I mean, fundamentally, we've been drug warriors for years, and we have to maintain this attitude that there's something inherently wrong with marijuana and anybody who would use it. I mean, they were arguing, for example, basically saying, well, we're not sure you're breastfeeding even. I mean,
Right.
questioning that somehow this was a whole made-up story.
Right, yeah, absolutely. I mean, going as far as to say that we need, a second doctor to even check and see if he has epilepsy, or that cannabis, even is a treatment for epilepsy, which the state has already said it is. So
I went up afterwards and I asked him, because I said, the licensing and regulation, it's not administration, it's another term, I forget which it is, agency. They had already listed certain conditions. If you have those conditions, then you can use medical marijuana. And I asked him why it is that the court would have a different standard than that, because don't they have to sort of accept what the state of Michigan. Obviously, if you were taking it for a condition that wasn't covered, they'd be quick to give you a hard time about it.
Right.
So don't they have to accept the ones that the state allows? And he seemed to think, well, that was just sort of a peripheral issue, and that he didn't have to follow that. Unfortunately, I have checked, and the American Neurology Association is still fighting the idea of cannabis for children. In the case of Dr. Sanjay Gupta, he has that very moving special which shows the little 5-year-old girl whose life was literally saved by this. And it was sort of jarring to hear one of their doctors say, oh, well, no, that drug doesn't, cannabis doesn't work for that. Well, it sure did in her case. I would certainly think that little girl needed some help. So does that pose a problem for you? Is it just luck of the draw which doctor you get? Joshua, is that how the standard works? Can a judge say, well, one doctor gets to rule on your legality on something like this?
I don't believe so, no. I don't think there's any doctor better to be able to diagnose or to, treat the condition with cannabis than the doctor that person's seeing. And somebody that, Steve, for instance, has seen that doctor numerous times. And I don't think one doctor from seeing Steve one time could override the opinion of Steve's primary care physician that's seen all the records, seen the way it works, and that it's efficient at treating his epilepsy.
Do you have any indication yet on how they're going to choose this neurologist that will do the?
I have not.
Where that person would come from? Would it be Ingham County? Would it be a blind draw? Nothing.
I have no idea how they're going to pick that
Steve,
doctor.
you've been through this. Is there some sort of magical test? They put a stick in your mouth and take it to the lab, and they say, this proves your epilepsy. I mean, how does that work?
No, the classification of epilepsy in itself is to have 2 seizures that happen that are not caused from a specific thing. So to have 2 random seizures would classify you as epileptic. And I've had probably over 300 grand mal seizures. So there's definitely not a doubt in my mind or any physician that's ever seen me before that I do have epilepsy. And, as Joshua mentioned there, the best doctors to treat me would be the doctors that I've seen, a dozen times. And the doctors, in my case, cannabis was actually a last alternative. I had tried every other medication. So for some people, they're lucky enough to get into, taking cannabis and having a great relief from it before they have to go through all the other gamut of drugs. In my particular case, I went through all the other drugs already, and none of them would completely control my seizures, and I just had more and more troubles. And it seemed that once you get on a pharmaceutical, it causes a side effect, and then they have to write you another pharmaceutical to offset that side effect. And so there was times when they would stack prescriptions on top of prescriptions, and then you would be on Nexium, which is a stomach pill, because now you're having irritated stomach and other problems like that. And so my doctor, he sent me to neurology. He did all my follow-up care, and we decided together that this would be the next step of treatment. And when it happened, I was blown away. that cannabis was as effective as it was.
It really was a miracle drug.
It was for me a miracle drug.
Yeah. Now, it may not be for everybody, but for the patients for whom it works, it seems to be, the results are absolutely astounding.
Mm-hmm.
And they're now finding so many, now that there's a bit of an opening for more research. It seems as though every day there's an announcement of a new condition that it really seems to be effective for. So this idea that somehow this was all a charade and people were pretending that it helped with conditions is really not true. I mean, remarkable changes in people that have occurred as using this drug.
Well, I think it's also noteworthy to mention like drugs such as Marinol and Sativex, which are cannabis derivatives or synthetic cannabis products that are FDA approved, and Sativex is going through the stages to be FDA approved. And to think that you can make the same thing at home and be able to treat yourself, I think might be one of the big hysterias is, you know, the pharmaceutical market owns so much of the industry, and yet there isn't one pharmaceutical company that's here in America. They're all owned off-site, off the land. So,
Before we move into some of the legal issues on that, this is LCC Radio, WLNZ here in Lansing, Michigan, and we're talking with Steve and Maria Green, and they also had a protest last week that I think drew a lot of attention to this case. You had a number of supporters who showed up because of the loss of your daughter, but I've been thinking about the irony that you ended up in a circumstance where you were supposedly protected by your marijuana cards, and your caregiver cards down in Oakland County, and that county is gaining a reputation as being an unwelcome place for people who want to exercise their rights over the Michigan medical marijuana law. So you moved to Ingham County to get away from the people in Oakland County, and then you run into a judge who has a couple years ago decided that it's absolutely you cannot use medical marijuana if you basically have a child in the house,
right.
And he ends up being the judge on your case. I mean, it seems, which county are you going to go to? We're joined by Charmie Gholson of Michigan Moms United. Is there a safe county in the state?
There are safe counties in the state. As you know, there are 83 counties in Michigan, and there's a patchwork of enforcement regarding pretty much everything, but specifically the Medical Marijuana Act, because that's what's on the line here. It's not Steve and Maria per se and their beautiful little family, but rather the entire Medical Marijuana Act that's on trial in that courtroom.
You think they're trying to get rid of it?
Oh, I know so. In fact, the DEA, this is a national war. This is a real war with real funding and real soldiers and real strategies, and it's national. So as soon as we pass the Medical Marijuana Act, the DEA came into Michigan and started delivering presentations. The first one that I became aware of was August 2010 in Ypsilanti. It was the Michigan Township Association meeting, and the DEA was there delivering their usual talking points, which are A, marijuana is not medicine, period, and B, here's how you can begin to what I consider removing protections provided in the act, but their whole gig is to invalidate it through education, through the media, which they've until now had unfettered access to, and they just present press releases to the media and they print them because, as you know, journalism, that old gray mare just ain't what she used to be.
True.
And so the DEA came in and they developed the little 7-word zoning amendment that allowed municipalities to completely ban the Medical Marijuana Act by saying that you can't have any business or association that goes against local state or federal law. And that's how they began passing the moratoriums on a statewide level. Like you probably noticed it right away. Little villages and cities everywhere, like, oh, we got to have a moratorium until we figure this stuff out. We're not quite sure what's going on.
Yes.
And that was DEA led. And likewise, and I can't remember what triggered me onto this. That's their talking point, at least the DEA, to come in and say it's not medicine, absolutely not. And they get to people really quickly, especially municipal leaders like the Michigan Townships Association and the Michigan Municipal League. And actually, Catherine Misch, Grand Rapids City Attorney Catherine Misch, gave a presentation at the Michigan Municipal League meeting in September 2010. And she outlined this entire strategy for us back then, where she said, first and foremost, she urged this room full, 75 to 100 members of municipal leaders. She urged them to join in a lawsuit challenging the Medical Marijuana Act based on federal supremacy, to continue to arrest and prosecute people for marijuana, even when they were state sanctioned, and then challenge those, because judges, right away they would get a case and they would say, this is legal, and they would, dismiss it.
Right.
And the prosecutors would then appeal it, which is how we've gotten all of these higher court rulings.
I see.
It's a strategy, and she laid it all out for us in September 2010. I look back on it now, and it's just like torture that we weren't able to circumvent it. But, when states pass medical marijuana laws, they've been working their butts out to get the darn thing passed without resources and splinter groups trying to work together. They're not as organized as the DEA. They don't have as much funding as the DEA. And guess what? We're still winning. I didn't feel this way till recently, but when the federal attorney general issues a statement saying, the whole federal minimum sentencing guidelines, we're going to put that tool back in the toolbox.
I was
when
surprised.
When Senator Leahy holds hearings on a federal level about legalizing marijuana, it's shocking to see that kind of awareness and movement on a federal level.
I think what we're seeing is, I was stunned by the rapidity of the change in the social movement for gay marriage, which at one point 10 years ago was absolutely anathema. And in fact, you could use it as a wedge issue on a ballot to bring out conservative voters, and you could always get gay marriage on the ballot to get everybody to pass it. 10 years later, absolutely total sea change in the culture. I think there's been this sort of fulminating desire for decades on the part of a lot of people to see marijuana either legalized or decriminalized, and that's, I think, going to be a tough issue. But anyhow, clearly change the laws on that. And I think it's reaching critical mass now, but the backlash is going to get ferocious.
And it's already been ferocious coming out of Oakland County, like these good people have experienced, where they've told me over and over again, and plenty of people, there's no such thing as the Medical Marijuana Act. We go by federal law.
That's the prevailing wisdom, that somehow you can just ignore state law now and you can just rely on the federal law. And we have seen the DEA come in and make some dramatic raids. We have the Okemos 7. I mean, I just keep seeing these sad postings from Joanne Forsberg, whose husband Dennis. She's had to move down there to South Carolina in order to be near him in a federal facility. I mean, there's really no good reason for that man to be in prison down in the South, and her son is in prison. And these are people who thought they were following the law. They went out and talked to all the local officials and said, hey, if you have any problem with our facility, let us know. We'll work with you. We'll rectify it. And instead, they're the subject of a raid, and their lives have been upended forever. I was part of the community policing movement for 9 years. I was associate director of the National Center for Community Policing. The idea was that there were communities in which open drug dealing on corners was causing a lot of chaos in the community. And our challenge was to figure out non-arrest strategies to help with the problem. Things that you could do to move it back indoors, get prostitutes off the street, start to try to reclaim communities, because you need that kind of community control, but you don't want to be throwing people in prison. If you've got a problem in your community with those kinds of difficulties, there are alternative strategies that are far less expensive, much more effective, and they don't lead to this militarization of the police that I'm very frightened about. Mm-hmm. I think, unfortunately, as a result of 9/11, we lost that battle. Mm-hmm. And we've now moved to a military-style policing and a real ferocity on the part of the criminal justice system, and that it's a punitive model. It's back to a punitive rather than a collaborative model.
Well, these things all started in the 80s when Congress began to pass laws that allowed the Pentagon to funnel equipment and training and those sorts of things to local police. And if you listen to any of the LEAP speakers, Dave Doddridge was one of the original SWAT guys out of LA, and he told me repeatedly, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, of course that's who I'm speaking about regarding LEAP speakers, he told me repeatedly that after the initial influx of training and equipment, the police become addicted to that sort of thing as well. Here you've got all this cool stuff and this cool training. And, my goal as the founder of Michigan Moms United is to return the multi-jurisdictional drug task forces and the SWAT teams. For instance, Oakland County has their own drug task force. They don't participate in Michigan's multi-jurisdictional drug task forces, and they also bring in the second highest amount of asset forfeiture in the state.
Yeah, we'll talk about
Oakland County, yeah. And I'm happy to talk about that with you at any time. But, my goal is to put those highly specialized, highly militarized SWAT teams back to their original intended purpose, which is hostage standoff. You got a guy with a gun in the tower shooting at people, haul those guys out. They don't get to go to homes where there are children present. And we don't want them doing any kind of drug raids because, as you learned with community policing, when police arrest a rapist or a murderer, they've made that community safer. And if you go and arrest a drug dealer, all you've done is create a job opening, maybe several.
Exactly, and you've probably traumatized some children in the process.
Yes, they all have PTSD. Everybody that's raided has PTSD.
And
Everyone that I've spoken to.
We have a two-tiered policing system in which we have one type of policing that occurs in low-income neighborhoods with the battering rams going through the door, and the walled communities where they police themselves and the police don't come in from the outside, or the college campuses where even though there's drug dealing going on, you don't see the battering rams in the dorm doors. That doesn't happen. So it's led to this unfortunate kind of real inequality in policing as well, and which was really of serious concern to me because I did anti-violence work in 60 different public housing developments. And to be honest about it, we succeeded in bringing down the violence level. I'm going to claim it, and I had a very tiny part in it. But when I look at what's happening in Chicago nowadays, we had brought down the violence levels in Chicago through the Chicago area neighborhood groups and working a lot with the neighborhoods and having police out on the street working with community groups. It wasn't a militarized model. But it was actually a friend of mine. I was working on a project with PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, flew into Washington, and one of our team members was leaving for a new job, and he was going to become the head of the new Federal Office of Technology to take all that military hardware and start funneling it to the police. And I said, wait a minute, is that a good idea? Why do we need, and oh, well, it'll be wonderful. The technology is great. No, I mean, we're talking about tanks. You know, we have always been proud of the fact that we've been nervous in this country about ever having a national police force. Very afraid of that. Our founding fathers, that's why they made policing much more localized in the United States than anywhere else. But now we've got the federal government funneling tanks to local police agencies, which just seems insane to me.
Who are they going to use those tanks on?
I
can tell you that police arrest about 16% of rapists in our state. This is a great place to live if you're a rapist. And we have 85% arrest rate per incident for drugs across the board, county to county and year to year, and prostitution. So who are they going to use those tanks on? Who are they building all of the prisons for? It's not the rapists or the murderers.
There is a new move. I just saw there's new legislation pending where the Corrections Corporation of America is going to various states and saying, if you guarantee us an 85% occupancy rate, we will take over your prisons and run all of them for you.
They sent those letters in November of last year, and apparently Michigan has picked it up because, as you probably know, and during the lame duck session, the Republicans pushed through a bill to open the Baldwin prison, which was closed because people died there. It was a very bad scene. And now, fortunately, and this is very strange about drug policy reform, you find yourself in bed with all kinds of people you would have never considered sleeping with. But you do it for the good of the colony, the greater of the colony. So the prison guards union, who are typically very anti-drug policy reform because that's their job security, have led the charge against privatization of prisons in Michigan. And they actually assembled all the numbers and the budgetary issues so that this last year, the Corrections Corp of America, were unable to obtain the contracts they need to reopen and run the Baldwin prison simply because they couldn't reduce the cost. But this is a situation where they're going to be coming back again and again, year after year, looking to get those contracts.
Right to work will have an implication on that, considering what it's going to do to municipal unions, because it will be harder, harder to maintain the level of pay for prison guards that we've had. I mean, we see the kind of thing that Joe Arpaio, who was famous for down in Arizona, the idea of Maricopa County, feeding green spoiled bologna to prisoners is somehow viewed as a good thing. These are as if they aren't our friends and neighbors that we've been putting away and who are going to be coming back to our communities. We treat them as if they're almost some sort of different subspecies.
And that's the legacy of the failed drug war. And here we see, with Stephen Maria Green, here we see how that's transitioned into Child Protective Services and into an arena where folks ordinarily don't think about, tanks and that sort of thing. But by God, they've taken their daughter based on the possibility of there being some sort of armed threat, and which they've never faced an armed threat until the state came to take their daughter from them.
Well, it is too like pointing a giant red arrow at you and saying, "Come get them." I mean, the idea, and also the idea that the thing that kept bothering me about your case as well was that they kept talking about you smoking marijuana in the home. You've always taken cannabis oil. What exactly are they talking about? It doesn't even make any sense at that level.
Yeah, it kind of fathoms me in several areas as far as that goes. Like you said, you've seen me speak before, and I've always been open and forthcoming with the House of Representatives and everyone else, and made videos and talked about my cannabis use and what helps my epilepsy, and that's the internal ingestion of marijuana, especially in an oil form that would be put in a capsule, and so you would take it no differently than you would take any other medication that was in a pill form. So it just
Now, since you were ordered off of cannabis oil, the appeals court has now banned the use of that kind of medical. You can't even use your drug if you get in the form you would want to if you're authorized to go back to it. Is that right?
Yeah, it's they've seemed to attack every area that they can, so that they could try to force this to go away. And there's some legal questions there, as far as what can be done and stuff like that. But yeah, the most effective form for me is to take cannabis oil orally. And when they question that, what do they think, that I came out months and months and years ago and started this statement about how I take it and what I do, just in case Child Protective Services ever came? I mean,
it's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, the logic escapes me.
There are a lot of assumptions here that people make, and it comes again from the reefer madness. It comes from uneducated people who just make these assumptions that if you're a medical marijuana patient, you must just be smoking to get high all the time.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is, people are not realizing that there are other ways to take cannabis than just smoking it. There are other forms of cannabis than ones that just get you high. And often patients who use it for medical benefits don't get high from it because they're taking it as a medicine as opposed to a party drug. And so there's all these things that you kind of pile on top of one another and on top of one another, and shows that it's just like any other herb. But the problem is that people, the public, the judge, the prosecutors, the CPS people are all just jumping to these conclusions that if you're a patient, you have to be smoking it. And so there's probably smoke all over the place, and your house probably reeks, and you're probably just high all the time and can't take care of your kids. And those are all things that are just not true. Right, absolutely.
And it's all wrapped in this moniker of public safety,
right?
Which we know the real problem, when people get confused between a drug problem and a drug policy problem. And it's very Orwellian. Like, if you look at all of the issues that people point to and say, we've got a drug problem, it's almost always actually our drug policies.
We have a drug prohibition policy problem, yes,
yep.
Indeed. Mm-hmm. I mean, go ahead, Bill.
Do you remember when we had William Whitbeck on?
Yes.
And he had written a book on prohibition. William Whitbeck is on the Michigan Court of Appeals, and he had written a book fiction book on prohibition, the Purple Gang. But do you remember he said that he thought the law prohibiting marijuana was a bad law?
And he's on the Court of Appeals?
Yes, and he equated it to prohibition, alcohol in the 30s.
He must be in the minority, because the Court of Appeals keeps just hammering us.
I know. One of the things I think that is so unfortunate, we pulled back from prohibition of alcohol relatively quickly when you look at it. By that time, though, we had already established fairly violent gangs who were involved. I mean, this was the birth of the mafia. This was what funded the mafia for many years, and it's what allowed it to move into legitimate businesses and use shakedowns and wreak violence. We've let this drug war go on so long that we have almost ingrained violence in the culture.
And
we need to undo this, because we can't spend any more time under this kind of prohibition. It just is so corrosive.
And, we re-legalized alcohol after, 10 or 12 years.
Yeah.
So we had an advantage when women like ourselves re-legalized alcohol back then and to save our children. We had an advantage because we still had memory of what it looked like to manufacture, distribute, sell, and consume alcohol under legal basis.
Right.
Whereas here with marijuana, there's no reference. If you were alive when marijuana was legal, you're a zombie or a vampire or something.
You have to go back before the Harrison Act. And see, remember, that was the era in which women were the largest, for the only time in the history of the world, women were the largest group of drug users in that era, because of Lydia Pinkham's used to have opium in it. And all these women were, they were, I have female problems. I really like that. Between the alcohol in it and the opium, they talk about, I was reading some books on this. I've written on this subject extensively. I mean, Thomas Alva Edison, remember how he was famous for sleeping 4 hours a night?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's because he was drinking coca-laced wine. It was legal. And he was, he loved that stuff.
That's a great idea.
It is, yeah. Coca-Cola had at least one line of cocaine in it. I mean, the real problem has been that since in the post-Harrison Act era, that's been a long time that we've criminalized drugs. And it wasn't gone after with the ferocity, though, for many years until I think what happened to Mark A.R. Kleiman, who's a drug policy expert out of Harvard. He and I have talked about this on occasion. There was a time in the 60s when marijuana use went up among college kids. And Bill, you'll remember those kids.
I don't recall.
There's probably a reason that But they were
That's what college is for, Bill.
Long-haired guys, right, in striped trousers and listening to rock music, right, and there was a sense, and this is an interesting sidelight that Kleiman talks about, fathers didn't like to see their sons feminized. That long hair, lace shirts, bell-bottom trousers. There was a backlash on the part of conservative, sort of hard-head parents, like, wait a minute, I didn't send my kid to college to turn him into one of those people, right? And there was this huge backlash against marijuana. There were nasty laws on the books. Somebody like Terry Barr down in Texas was sentenced to 27 years for half a joint. I talked to Sheriff Vanoy, who was the sheriff and a friend of hers in that county, and he said one of the worst travesties of justice that he had ever seen, even though he was on the law enforcement side. But it was used in a punitive way occasionally, but not very many people were picked up under it. But there was this real backlash against the 60s looseness, against the sort of quote-unquote excesses of the 60s that really led to a lot of drug laws that we're still paying the price for now, the escalation of the drug war. Mandatory minimums have caused so much trouble. I mean, but you're awfully brave to come out and talk in an era when you're facing felony charges. Do you think that your activism has made you a target?
Sometimes I do. We have a public face, and so people, know who we are. And I think one of the things too is that we, because of our role in the activist community, we are very principled people, and so when they say, "Can I get in your house?" we stick to, you need a warrant,
right?
And
because that's what the law said.
Absolutely, and so I've seen this more than. When you stick up for yourself, when you stick to your guns, the backlash is often worse.
Does that seem that you have to be careful? What is the strategy as an attorney? I'm so surprised to see Joshua here, because what do attorneys normally say? They say, don't say anything. Never talk about the case until it's adjudicated. That's usually the defense attorney's role. But you're out front on this issue and understand that there's a public education piece that needs to be done. Is that the missing piece here?
Yeah, that's completely it. And the other thing is that we have nothing to hide as far as this goes. I think they've been very upfront about what takes place in the home, and there's nothing wrong with that. So we have nothing to hide. We want to put it all out there.
Yeah.
This is a massive cultural shift. I mean, when we passed the law, remember in 2008, it was unheard of for people to go online and comment on an article about people being arrested for marijuana and saying that is a waste of resources. Don't police have something better to do? And now it's common. It's so common. It happens far in the majority. And this is what I mean. Like, we are still winning with no money, and we're exhausted.
Yeah.
And they're taking our kids and they're taking our stuff, and we're still winning public opinion. However, that's not possible until legislators and communities and the media understand what executing a warrant really looks like. They understand the inner workings of Child Protective Services and how hysterical they are and how much they have too much power. Unfortunately, I mean, I've been doing raid response for a couple of years in Michigan and talking to people who were just raided, and unfortunately, until the perfect case came along with the Greens, until this beautiful little white baby, I'm going to say it, this little white baby that's gorgeous,
She is, and she
She's
loves her
so
mother.
gorgeous.
I've been there and seen you with your daughter, and Bree is just the happiest,
She's like a little
bubbliest
fairy.
baby
Like
I've
when
ever
she
seen.
blinks her eyes, there should be a little bell that goes ding. She's just really delicious,
I wanted to kidnap her.
But until this perfect situation, this perfect scenario came along where
Right.
these people are advocates, they're honorable, and they stand steadfast in the line of fire to say, no, we do know our rights, and no, you're not coming into our grow room. That's illegal. You can't go in there.
Right.
With my organization, people can get very upset when people with the perfect poster child sort of situation won't come forward and go to the media or speak to legislators. And I urge everyone to be patient, because the drug war is not going to stop churning out victims for us.
No, it's not.
There's one after another. My phone's ringing off I bet you're starting to get tons of calls by now, Joshua.
Yes.
From people that are just desperate and want more help.
But they've been fearful, and I understand why, because they're, I used the word fearsome power of the state in the article that I was writing about the Greens, because they can come down with a huge club and just crush you. And
they retaliate, they extort you. I've seen it over and over again. I wrote a feature for my newspaper, The Midwest Cultivator, about asset forfeiture, where Ed Boyke had been raided, and they came and took his widescreen TV and his humidifier, and they tied him to his table and taunted him about who he voted for, and then the next day came back and said, how much money have you got? $5,000. Oh, what a coincidence. It's going to cost you that much to get all your stuff back. And I published in the story.
I'm surprised he got his stuff back.
He didn't.
Oh.
I published I published in the story that the only thing that he wanted was a rifle given to him by his now dead wife's father. And so after that story was published, he went to go get his stuff, and they said, oh yeah, that rifle, the DEA's got it, you have to go see them. And so he went to the DEA, and they said, you don't talk to the media anymore, and maybe we'll give you your rifle back. And he still hasn't gotten his rifle back.
That's how that works.
And that's one case after another, and look at what happened to Ryan Basor. I put his face on my newspaper and said, here's the Green Mile in Lansing. Here's how these people with these dispensaries have revitalized these areas where there were empty buildings. They've instituted good neighbor projects. They've created safety where their building is. And Judy says we don't want those kind of jobs. When you've got 50 single moms working on the front end of these, it's feeding families, goods are shipped. This is good for our economy. And they raided him. They hovered Black Hawk helicopters over his house and followed his girlfriend when she left. This is a failed public policy. It has not slowed the flow of drugs into society. It has not kept drugs out of our kids' hands. It has not reduced death and disease. What it has done is it has empowered militarized local police forces that they have no oversight at all. And they're they don't like being called out. They don't like attention, and they retaliate. It's war. It's a real war.
It's ego, identity, and it's power and money. And boy, when you put all of those together, that's a really potent combination. I used to be I went to Chicago once when they were, Anton Valukas, who was the U.S. attorney for the district at the time. There was a special conference on forfeiture that I went to. And it was really, somebody like me, I don't know how they ever let me in on these meetings, by the way, Bill, but I'm sitting there in the audience, and they're giving all this training about how, remember to grab it way before, stall the court case as long as possible. Because it doesn't matter if they're found not guilty as long as you've already gotten rid of the assets and you've got the money for it. And it really was how to make money on asset forfeiture. And it was hilarious because one guy stood up and said, it's kind of like Robin Hood. And then he said, oh, but wait a minute, we'd kind of be like the sheriff of Nottingham. And I thought, yeah, kind of. Robbing from the poor.
Kind of, exactly.
To give to the rich.
Mm-hmm.
And what people don't realize is that you can have your assets seized. They've done it with factories. I know they did it with an expensive racehorse, which, by the way, they misfed and the racehorse died. They seize these assets all over.
They don't even have to charge you.
No. They just, your criminal case is irrelevant to the civil forfeiture.
It's why you see crazy cases like the city of Inkster versus a widescreen TV. And I started a Facebook page called Dildos for Justice. After I guess I should go there and see what's been posted recently. Where, after doing
batteries forever ready.
Batteries for everyone. After doing raid response for a couple of years in Michigan, I began to realize that consistently drug task forces were stealing sex toys and taking all kinds of things like that. And what they will do is they'll photograph dildo, gun, money. marijuana, and then it becomes part of the public record, part of the criminal case and the evidence, and it's just a matter. It's a way to intimidate women. They don't want them to come and get their stuff. So I started the Facebook page and I said, listen, these poor guys, Oakland County Narcotics Enforcement Team, they need love. Send them your dildos. I gave the address.
Don't make them see.
I mean, and this is I'm desperate. This is the actions of a desperate woman who just can't believe I live in this parallel universe. Did you ever think this would happen to you? Ever?
Never.
You live, up is down, right is wrong, the good guys are bad, the bad guys are good, and until we can get that very simple piece in place where our drug problem is really a drug policy problem and start to unravel that,
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ here in Lansing, Michigan. Bill, you said that part of the challenge, you had a question there.
Well, I want to just quickly go back to, and this may not be the right forum to do this, but I still believe the way to get this changed is by the ballot box. There has to be a concerted effort to get judges out that don't agree with you.
Right.
Legislators that don't agree with you, and other elected officials.
We were pleased to see Representative Jeff Irwin from Ann Arbor at your rally the other day. So clearly you have a growing number of people in the political sphere who have come out. I mean, that's a good sign to see a state rep there.
Absolutely, and several of them have held Bree. And like I said, we've always been forthcoming.
Kissing babies.
It's better yet.
Always been forthcoming, and so we would go to town hall meetings and other events where we would see them, and they would check in and look in the stroller or ask, can I pick her up and get a picture taken or whatever. And that's one of the things, and I think you make a good point, Bill. Once this happens, and it happened in Colorado, but once it happens where one or two officials are taking down, either at the ballot box or on a recall type situation, the rest of them learn from that. And so that's an incredibly strong way to show public opinion on this. And we can't seem to go anywhere. We go to the drugstore to pick up a prescription, and we have 3 or 4 different people that come up to us and just say, I'm praying for you guys, and I support you. And I've never used marijuana, or I haven't done it since college, but we're really pulling for you guys on this. So.
And that's the thing, people with this drug policy reform is made up of people who love drugs, people who hate drugs, like the recovering community, and people who don't give a damn about drugs. But we all understand that the drug policy is what is creating all of this disaster for people.
I also want to see a public education, because part of the challenge, Bill, is that that in things like judges' races, it's very hard to get information as to what judge who on what side. So part of what the organizations need to do is put together flyers and make it available to members and share it online that says, here in your local races, here are the people who are on your side, here are the people who are on the other side. And I was hoping at one point, I want to do a feature on you two as creative entrepreneurs. You've invented this new thing, Canology, which is made out of herbs, that is a vaporized type of medication, and it has no illicit substances in it whatsoever. And you're the kind of people that the state should be supporting as this new breed of drug entrepreneurs. They're saying what, 600 million is what it's going to generate in Colorado? This is a potential bonanza for the state of Michigan, and it's people like you, they should be. So we need to tell some of those good stories too, some of the positive stories about people who are making a real difference.
Absolutely. And, going back to your list of compiling, a friend of ours in Jackson, she's actually part of my organization, The Human Solution, and she has been really has a push to start a database like that for all the particularly judges. And she's going to start it, kind of in Jackson County, and we're hoping to expand from there, but it's a lot of work. And but to be able to have something where you can go to and say, well, this is how they ruled in this case, and this is, how they seem biased in this case. And because, quite frankly, judges are people, and they can't, I think it's impossible for human beings to check their conscience at the door, whether they're a judge or not. So having these kind of things so that you can go access them, when you're about to vote and things like that. The other thing that I've noticed is that judges rarely have opponents. This is the case particularly in Oakland County.
It's been 100 years since there was an incumbent judge that has been not elected.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So they go largely, unopposed.
Run down there. Oh, you'd have to move back there. I don't think you should move back there. But we've got young attorneys like Joshua here, who is an activist on this issue. You're identified as a normal attorney, NORML, right? And that's a group of attorneys who have decided that they want to specialize in trying to protect people's rights in this regard. How does that organization approach something like this?
Well, I'm a member of the Normal Legal Committee, and it's a
Okay.
group of attorneys that all get together to share information, share ideas, and that sort of thing. We communicate frequently on a listserv where these sorts of, the Green case has been brought up on the listserv, and there have been attorneys across the country discussing this issue. And so for right now, that's where how most of us participate. Normal has their own board of directors and staff that have their own positions. And I think a lot of what they try to do is education, lobbying, and that sort of thing. So there's lots of ways to go about this, and I think Normal is doing a good job promoting these causes.
How do we get rid of the stigma? There's a residual
Continued
stigma.
education, just like and you guys are talking about getting rid of judges. None of that can happen until people understand what the drug policy does to families.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to continue the education.
Mm-hmm.
And I would encourage people who want to tell their stories but don't want to go to the media, we can take you to closed door sessions. Call up Stephen Marie at the Human Solution. Call myself up over at Michigan Moms United. We can take you into closed door sessions with your legislators so that you can give them, and the filter works. It's great news.
We pushed the
The
button.
filter's working.
You didn't blurt out what
I
you
didn't
meant to.
blurt it out. I'm thrilled.
Thank you.
You're welcome. But yes, I mean that the stigma is removed by education, by people understanding that we're not. I mean, how do we end racism? Your daughter marries a black man and has a mixed baby. How do we end
Look at
homophobia?
the LGBT issue. All
Yeah.
of a sudden, people found out that they had a gay person in
Yeah,
their
your
family
nephew
who'd been
comes out as
hiding
a
out
gay
all those
man.
years and not coming to Thanksgiving dinner and not
Right.
bringing his partner to Thanksgiving dinner, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. And now you find out there's somebody in your family that has glaucoma and they try it. And then they have maybe MS and they try it. Or their child has a seizure disorder and they find out that it works. But that's a slow process. I think we need to be more proactive about explaining to people these stories. I think the Sanjay Gupta thing on CNN probably has had one of the biggest effects of anything that I've
Huge.
seen. But
See if he
that's
gets his contract renewed.
well, yeah, the former U of M.
Yeah.
Remember, he was going to be Surgeon General.
Surgeon General of the United States.
Yeah. So when you have someone of that stature, that's who Obama's first choice was. That carries an awful lot of weight, and I think
It was huge.
Yeah.
It was bizarre.
It was.
I mean,
it was
for
really.
some, because I've been doing this work for a little while here, and watching the law enforcement against prohibition guys, just work really, really, really hard and go to little Rotary Club meetings and do this education, and that's what changes things, is grassroots activism. You guys are in Lansing right now explaining to people, they're going into stores and people are approaching them. That's effective. This has been an effective campaign at the torture of this family.
I met Howard Woolridge on his horse when he was coming
Oh,
through
Howard.
Michigan in order to
he's
go to
great.
the East Lansing Rotary, and it was fascinating to watch. That video is actually up online on my YouTube channel. And Howard, within an hour, took all of these people who were really very staunch drug warriors,
Easy.
and he persuaded, I'd say 90% of the people in that room that, wow, I never looked at it that way.
Yeah.
It's not the drugs, it's the
Powerful.
policy, and it is how corrosive this is, how it's corrupted the police, how forfeiture has corrupted the system, how we're seeing this militarization of the police. I come out of a family where my grandfather did time in a federal prison under Prohibition because he was a bootlegger, right? And I watched what it did to our family. My grandmother gave my father away to a farm family as labor because she couldn't afford to keep him anymore because Dad was in prison. That's what happens to people who get caught up in this. And that was to know, but we look back now and we view Prohibition as a joke. And it was funny, and it was just sort of one of that funny little weird era in our lives. In my family, it had a devastating effect for generations because of the poverty that's caused. I mean, we have an entire criminalized class of people who did nothing more than share, as your group says, a plant with somebody, and their lives were ruined. And that's a big burden, I think, for our society to bear.
Yeah, I think another way to bring attention to at least the CPS issue involving medical marijuana is for individuals that grew up in a home where marijuana was even used illegally to stand up
your parents.
and to say, yes, exactly.
And look how you turned out.
Yeah, it's not something I'm ashamed of or embarrassed. Not something I choose to hide at all. I'm open about it. I'm glad with the way I was raised, and I think that's part of who I am today, and I'm happy with who I am.
Yeah.
And I think if more people came out and said these sorts of things, there wouldn't just be what people perceive as negative examples out there. You would also see positive examples.
When the judge kept saying, imagine what would happen to children in that home, right? I kept thinking about you. And I'm surprised you didn't say, hey, wait a minute.
You're looking at it, Garcia, right here, this attorney.
We want to thank Charmie Gholson and Joshua Covert and Stephen Maria Green. This has been a remarkable hour. I urge people to look at Lansing Online News online and see the archived version of the show later on our webcam. And we will see you next Monday night. This is WLNZ LCC Radio 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. See you next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry I was late.
I'm
Sorry.
circling the block, looking for parking.
Yeah, it was parking was a nightmare.
Well,
But that's an
are you
interesting